Why is it that in some marriages, two people never argue, never raise a hand, never exchange a single harsh word, and yet it feels more suffocating than violent? You may have seen couples like this. He's considerate to a fault. Everything he does is beyond reproach. She's gentle and virtuous, keeping the home spotless. Outsiders would say they're a match made in heaven. But behind closed doors, the two of them live as if trapped in the same freezer. No words, no eye contact, no touch, no hatred, and no love. Only something far more terrifying than hatred: politeness. A meticulously maintained, airtight, suffocating kind of politeness. Anyone who's lived through it knows it feels like a gentle hand slowly closing around your throat. It won't kill you all at once. It just keeps you in this state day after day of almost suffocating, but never quite dying. You want to run, but you can't find a single legitimate reason because they've done nothing wrong. You want to hate them, but you can't because they genuinely are a good person. You want to scream, but the words won't come because you don't even qualify as a victim. You're just unhappy. And unhappy in everyone else's eyes is just being dramatic. Welcome to the Fanco Character Library. I'm Fanco. Today we're diving into a book by Nobel laureate François Mauriac. It's called The Kiss to the Leper. Don't let the title scare you. It's not about disease at all. It's about something far more terrifying. A beautiful common girl, arranged to marry an ugly but kind-hearted young nobleman. In this marriage, there's no infidelity, no domestic violence, no hysterical arguments. Two good people, bound together, and then they slowly drive each other insane. Reading it, you get this powerful sense of what you might call East Asian horror. Especially the wedding night passage. Mauriac doesn't write a single explicit word, yet it's more suffocating than any graphic depiction could ever be. I'll read it to you later. And here's something else that's fascinating. Mauriac, a Frenchman, somehow captures the exact kind of toxic, parasitic father-son dynamic that's all too familiar in East Asian families. The father doesn't see his son as a person, only as a possession. He never expresses love, only control. When his son gets married, he pretends to be asleep and doesn't show up. When his son dies, he's still pretending to sleep. His selfishness is something that seeps into the very marrow of his bones, so quiet, it makes your skin crawl. This episode touches on one of Nietzsche's most important philosophical concepts, slave morality. Difficulty level: 3 stars. But I promise you, after hearing this, you'll realize it's no ivory tower theory. It hides in every moment you say, forget it. It hides every time you dress up "I can't" as "I'm above competing." It hides every time you use kindness as an excuse to avoid change. Ready? Let's begin. Let's start by meeting our protagonist. His name is Jean Leper, born into a noble family in quiet decline. If fate were a dealer at a card table, the hand it dealt Jean was interesting. Family background: top tier. The Leper name was a golden brand in the region. Everyone bowed with respect at the mere mention. But his looks? A catastrophe. On the very first page, Mauriac hits us with a devastating blow, his small, stunted frame stumbling into the low mirror above the fireplace, reflecting nothing but a wretched face. Sunken cheeks, a long pointed nose with a reddened tip, coarse stubble forming a sharp widow's peak on his forehead. One grimace, and his gums and rotting teeth were laid bare for all to see. The author isn't describing a face, he's delivering a verdict. He wants you to know from page 1 this man's very existence is a predicament. But the most tormenting part isn't his ugliness. It's the fact that he should be extraordinary, yet he can't accomplish anything. Jean's class gave him dignity. He was born to be looked up to. But his body and his abilities gave him nothing to back that dignity up. Mediocre talent. No resilience of character, he'd abandon anything halfway through. Physically frail and small. Towering pride and crushing insecurity. Living inside the same body. At war with each other every single day. This kind of inner contradiction is 10,000 times more painful than simple insecurity. A simply insecure person would accept their lot. This is who I am, take it or leave it. But Jean couldn't do that. You deserve everything, his blood whispered. You deserve nothing, his mirror screamed back. Add to that a mother who died young and a cold, selfish father. And this boy, from birth to adulthood, never received even the slightest emotional nourishment from a single family member. And speaking of his father, I need to give him his own moment, because Monsieur Jérôme is such an archetypal figure, so typical, that you might just recognize him in your own life. Every afternoon from 1 to 4, without fail, he takes his nap. During those 3 hours, the entire mansion, and even the street outside, must maintain absolute silence. And then he wakes up angry. No matter how perfectly quiet you've kept things, he'll insist some noise woke him up. The man has issues. He's also in poor health, bedridden most of the time. So Jean's childhood and adolescence were spent mostly in quiet solitude. He gained long stretches of time for deep reading and reflection. But for someone like him, this was no blessing. Why? Because when someone who can do nothing is given endless time to think, the result is he fantasized about everything and yearned for everything. Fame, glory, heart-stopping romance. But none of these things, whether due to inner or outer limitations, were within his reach. All he could do was dream. The most painful state for a human being isn't having no desires. It's having a mind overflowing with desire without the slightest capacity to act. A soul trapped inside a glass dome. You can see all the wonders of the world outside, but you can never touch them. And then there was his servant's grandson, a boy about Jean's age, healthy, strong, and handsome, spending his days watering the vegetable garden in the courtyard. The town girls made no effort to hide their fondness for him. Every time Jean saw this young man, he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. He felt unworthy of being this handsome lad's master. Whenever he was near him, he became timid and awkward, like a deer caught in headlights. The novel has a passage so brutal I have to read it to you. A handsome young man, even a commoner, has the right to cast a bold and open gaze upon any young woman. Jean despised him with a vile jealousy, and loathed himself for the ugliness of that feeling. And then Jean murmured something to himself, "My soul." In the morning light of this summer day, this soul of mine turns out to be even uglier than my body. Let that sink in. His deepest agony isn't about physical ugliness that, at least, can be concealed. His deepest agony is that he discovered his soul to be even more wretched than his body. He despised that young man, not because the boy had done anything to wrong him, but because the boy's very existence was a negation of everything Jean was. This hatred made him feel vile, and realizing his own vileness made him loathe himself even more, a perfect spiral of self-destruction. And it was right at this moment that Jean happened upon a set of Nietzsche's books. This could have been his salvation, but for a man whose spirit was already on the verge of collapse, Nietzsche was not a lantern. It was a bottle of hard liquor. Drink it right, and it gives you courage. Drink it wrong, and it kills you. Jean drank it wrong. He stumbled upon Nietzsche's theory of master morality and slave morality. In simple terms, master morality holds that strength, creativity, and vitality are good. Weakness and servility are bad. Slave morality is the exact opposite. It redefines meekness, submission, and humility as virtues and brands strength, pride, and desire as evil. Its core mechanism is this: whatever I can't have, I declare to be bad. Whatever I can't do, I declare it noble not to do. We'll break this theory down in detail later. But the problem was, Jean only half understood it, and immediately applied it to himself. He fell into a fatal logical trap. I am exactly the kind of slave that Nietzsche condemns. My kindness, my patience, my humility, these aren't virtues. They're placebos that the weak invent to comfort themselves. He turned a philosophical theory into a courtroom, where he was both defendant and judge. Knowledge in the right hands is a torch. In the wrong hands, it's a noose. And then, right at this moment, fate played yet another massive joke on Jean: a marriage proposal. A match so beautiful, he wouldn't have dared dream of it. And it was precisely this marriage that pushed him over the edge, into the abyss. And it was precisely this marriage that pushed him over the edge, into the abyss. Beneath the surface of Jean's family, dark currents were stirring. His aunt and cousin had been watching and waiting, scheming to get their hands on the Pellouer estate. Jerome only had this one son, and the boy was so frail he could barely hold up the family name. Can you blame them for having ideas? A local priest who was on good terms with the father and son was working hard to help them hold onto the family legacy. The most direct solution: find Jean a wife and shore up the household. And the woman the priest recommended turned out to be the very girl Jean wouldn't have dared dream of. Noémie. Jean's first reaction when he heard the news: how could she possibly be interested in me? But the priest said he'd already tested the waters, and her family not only didn't object, they were practically thrilled. After all, this was the Pellouer family, old nobility. For a common girl to marry into that family, that was marrying up. How could Jean not be overjoyed? He'd never dared to hope for something like this. There's a line in the book describing their one and only prior encounter written with such restraint. Yet it's heartbreaking. As her shadow glided through the nave of the church, a cold fragrance brushed against Jean's skin. It was the only kiss he had ever tasted in his life. This man was truly suffocated by loneliness and starved of love. His entire life, he had never once experienced a woman's gaze filled with genuine desire. And now, out of nowhere, he was being handed a breathtaking beauty. The impact was staggering. After the initial euphoria came, of course, the self-doubt. Jean was certain Noémie would find him repulsive. So he turned to his father for reassurance. His father's response was classic: he didn't even bother arguing. Because he himself had never been loved, he naturally didn't believe his son could be so fortunate. The old man's logic was simple. You marry a wife to carry on the family line. She works, that's enough. Who cares whether she actually likes you? I've already looked into it, he said. This girl is extremely disciplined and proper, devout, God-fearing, obedient to her husband. And even after bearing many children, she'll remain humble. Translated into plain language, don't expect your wife to give you emotional fulfillment, just treat her as a breeding tool. And that's when Jean remembered Nietzsche. Yes, isn't this exactly my chance to break free from slave morality and seize control of my destiny? He'd always felt like the universe was against him, that luck had abandoned him. Now something wonderful had landed in his lap. He should embrace it boldly and believe, truly believe, that he deserves the best. But from our God's eye view, we already know his understanding of Nietzsche is dangerously shallow. So this giddy euphoria carries with it the scent of something ominous, like a man who can't swim, having learned 2 theoretical strokes, and now preparing to dive into the deep end. With that said, let's look at the iconic scene where the two finally meet. In Jean's mind, the girl had already stepped down from her pedestal. He was even desperately searching for flaws in Noémie, hoping to ease that crushing sense of unworthiness. But the contrast when they actually stood face to face was brutal. Jean was simply too scrawny and too ugly. Despite all his mental preparation, he couldn't stop the words from spilling out. He wasn't worthy of her. He was insecure. He was worthless. The more he talked, the more frantic he became, rambling endlessly, desperate to prove that the nobility of his soul could somehow compensate for the wretchedness of his appearance. Now, if we switch to the girl's perspective, this becomes a horror film. The two of them alone in a room, the adults all outside. Noémie stared at the closed door, not entirely surprised she'd heard the rumors about Jean Pellouer. He was the local eccentric, not quite right in the head. The novel tells us her fear hung in the balance. The door remained shut. The entire mansion was deathly silent. Only that hunched figure and his frantic gestures remained, pacing in the west chamber. The girl grew uneasy. A sour sting of tears welled up, catching in her breath. Jean finally sensed it, a sudden flash of fear in her eyes, as if she had found herself in a dark room where bats lurked unseen. The atmosphere had terrified the girl completely. When her mother reappeared, Noémie threw herself into her arms for comfort. The priest, acting as matchmaker, conveniently interpreted this gesture as the girl accepting the proposal. But no matter what her reaction, he would have interpreted it that way. What's interesting is what happened next. The townspeople were actually jealous of Noémie's family for landing this marriage. They thought the girl was marrying above her station. The priest was busy promoting the match. Yes, the Delaware boy is ugly, but his character is sterling. Women don't really have desires anyway, they'd say. A husband's inner qualities matter far more than his looks. You see, the entire community had conspired to build a narrative marrying him is your good fortune. All this external validation made Jean increasingly self-assured in the meetings that followed. He'd hold court, gesticulating wildly, showing off his half-baked learning. Whenever Jean held forth on the drawing room sofa, Noémie's solemn silence always led him to believe that, as the priest had said, a virtuous woman truly does value her fiancé's character above all else. People tend to push their luck. The newly confident Jean even began finding fault with Noémie, feeling she wasn't as dazzling, as heart-fluttering as she'd been at their first meeting. An ugly person is already hard enough to deal with. An overconfident ugly person is a straight-up disaster. If we shift our gaze back to the girl, we see the truth: she didn't accept anything. She simply had nowhere left to run. Right after the meeting, Noémie told her mother point blank, "I don't want to get married. I want to take religious vows and devote the rest of my life to God." But nobody cared what she felt. The matchmaker was the most respected priest in town. The groom was from old nobility. She had no right to say no. She compared the scrawny, ugly Jean to a cricket. This passage of inner monologue is genuinely unsettling. She gazed with sorrow upon her own chaste, untouched body, this flesh brimming with life's warmth yet pure as morning dew. How would that cricket harvest it? She understood that she must endure every caress, survive that mysterious and dreadful rite, and then bring forth a child, a dark, scrawny little Delaware. That cricket would gnaw away at the rest of her life, perched beside her pillow. Do you see it now? Before this marriage has even begun, both of them are already trapped in their own prisons. Jean suffers because he knows he doesn't deserve her. Noémie suffers because she's being forced to surrender herself to a man she instinctively recoils from. And yet they're both good people. Neither of them has done anything outrageous or unforgivable. Fate simply welded two souls who should never have been together with a marriage contract. And then the wedding day arrived. Monsieur Jerome didn't attend. He stayed in bed. But this kind of absurd behavior was nothing new. When his wife died years ago, he'd spent the entire funeral upstairs pretending to sleep. Got up right on schedule the moment the ceremony ended. Jean went to his room to ask for his blessing. He refused to see him, leaving his frail little son to face everything alone. The aunt and cousin, of course, showed up to stir the pot, faces drooping, as if they were at a funeral, muttering inauspicious remarks the entire time. As Jean's only two family members at the wedding, their words, no matter how hard he tried to brush them off, seeped in as a quiet, insidious form of psychological sabotage. And now we arrive at the main event. The wedding night. Fair warning, what comes next is uncomfortable. Beneath the washstand, the curtain had been left undrawn, toiletries piled up, shamelessly exposed. The wallpaper was stained with the remains of crushed mosquitoes. Through the open window, the damp breath of the bay rolled in, carrying fish, seaweed, and brine. The fading drone of an engine trailed away along the shipping lane. On the printed bed curtains, two guardian angels pressed their hands to their faces in a posture of modesty. Jean Delaware endured a long and grueling battle, first wrestling with his own frigidity, then grappling with what felt like a corpse. At dawn, 6 hours of combat ended with a faint, thin moan. Jean Delaware lay drenched in sweat, rigid, not daring to move, lying beside the body that had finally surrendered its resistance. More revolting than the worms that feed on the dead, Noémie lay like a sleeping martyr, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, as though she were on the verge of death. That face small and sharp like an abused child's, her hands crossed over her unsullied chest, her fingertips still clutching a slightly faded cloth scapular and a few crudely cast metal devotional medals. Before she woke, someone should have kissed her feet. lifted that tender body in silence, and entrusted it to the chaste foam of the sea. Mauriac didn't write a single dirty word. He used battle to describe lovemaking, corpse to describe the wife, martyr to describe the bride. This wasn't a wedding night. It was a murder without a killer, and this murder had only just begun. I want to take a brief detour here and talk about something rarely discussed in the open: the relationship between masculine psychic energy and female desire. Because I've noticed that many people genuinely don't understand Jean's later breakdown. They think this guy has money and status, so he's a bit ugly and his wife isn't into him. So what? A gorgeous woman, just use her and be done with it. Why would that be such a devastating blow? This kind of thinking exposes a deeply hidden cognitive blind spot. A certain group of people, especially those who champion traditional masculinity, severely underestimate the impact of desire on a man's psychological foundation. They habitually reduce male-female relationships to transactions of money and power. Because they've denied women's agency, they can't comprehend why a physically attractive, charismatic man, even one with nothing to his name, is still wildly sought after. The secret lies in female desire. And this isn't some abstract concept. Let me explain. In patriarchal societies, most men are born carrying a baseline confidence, a foundational sense of self that their gender bestows upon them. Then comes family stability, career advancement. A man's psychic fortitude is gradually built upon these pillars. Along these dimensions, most men don't differ all that much from one another, but there's a hidden source of sustenance that only those who've tasted it can understand, and that is authentic desire from the opposite sex. Note, I'm not talking about physical intimacy. Even without any physical contact whatsoever, a single glance, a certain atmosphere can transmit it. A significant number of men go their entire lives without ever experiencing genuine desire from any woman, even married men. Why? Because acknowledging the existence of female desire is, for patriarchal thinking, an extremely dangerous proposition. It means women have autonomous will. They have the power of choice. She won't choose you just because you're politically correct. She'll choose based on whether you're the one she actually wants. Your efforts might yield no returns whatsoever. Your moral correctness cannot be exchanged for attraction. And authentic female desire is aggressive, predatory, possessive. Once it appears, there's absolutely no mistaking it. When a woman reveals genuine desire for a man, the effect on his psychic foundation is profoundly positive, even more powerful than respect, because it's an affirmation of your very being. Not what you've done or what you own, but that your existence alone is enough to ignite longing. The psychological baseline forged in this atmosphere is more composed, more at peace, with far less inexplicable aggression. Of course, psychic energy is a neutral concept. It has nothing to do with moral goodness or evil. Many handsome men who later became arrogant and sleazy got that way from an overflow of psychic energy, just like the servant's grandson in our story. The reason I'm going on about all this is so you can truly understand how devastating that catastrophic wedding night failure was to Jean's psyche. He had secretly observed how Noemi and the servant's grandson interacted when they crossed paths. He had seen what Noemi looked like when she revealed her desire. The contrast with the deathly, martyred stillness she showed with him. They might as well have been two different species. On the wedding night, laid bare. The difference in their physiques was brutally obvious. And what was even more fatal, he couldn't perform. His body betrayed him before his mind could. The fragile Nietzschean confidence he'd managed to build before the marriage was erased to zero within days. Their honeymoon, originally planned for 3 weeks, ended after 10 days. Daily life after the wedding was even more twisted. Noemi threw herself frantically into housework, managing the household, nursing her bedridden father-in-law, emptying his bedpan without complaint, and attending Mass with religious fervor. Anything and everything to avoid any possible contact with Jean. The first few nights had clearly traumatized her, and Jean was perceptive enough to understand. Every morning he'd leave the house to wander the countryside, returning only after dark. The only happy person in the household was Jerome. His daughter-in-law had become his new entertainment. He didn't care one bit about this couple's absurdly dysfunctional relationship. As long as he was being taken care of, all was well. Every evening, Noemi would greet her husband at the door with enthusiasm. But she knew herself well this devoted wife act wouldn't last. One more moment, and the mask would crack. When they shared the bed, she would force herself to squeeze her eyes shut, bite down on her lips like a martyred maiden in the arena, throwing herself upon the wild beast, and take this pitiful man into her arms. Eventually, the two of them developed an unspoken understanding. Minimize all contact. Every night, Jean would lie in bed first and pretend to be asleep. Noemi would delay as long as possible before slipping back into the room, pressing herself into the narrow gap between the bed and the wall to sleep. At first, she still felt guilty because of Jean's kindness, until one night she woke to find his hands creeping over her body in the dark. That visceral, warm-blooded revulsion made her realize with perfect clarity her tolerance wasn't as high as she'd imagined. The two of them never once argued, polite as two diplomats at a summit, but deep inside, Jean still yearned for love. One day, the priest came to visit and suggested Jean move to Paris to pursue a career. When Noemi heard this, she first objected, then said she wanted to go with him. She wasn't doing this out of attachment, quite the opposite. She desperately wanted to live apart, but she'd been trained to play the dutiful wife, so she had to put on a show. The father-in-law panicked first. He didn't want his daughter-in-law to leave, just let Jean go alone. The destructive force of this gesture was far greater than it appeared. Remember when young Jean was about to leave for boarding school, and Jerome wept and begged him to stay? At the time, Jean believed that was fatherly love. But this time, he could no longer deceive himself about Jerome's true nature. His father had never loved his son, only himself. The man who'd once wept to keep him home was merely using his child as a tool to fight off the ebbing of his own life. Now that he had a more useful daughter-in-law, Jean had become expendable, one blow after another. In the week before Jean's departure, Noemi, perhaps relieved that he was finally leaving, performed the role of devoted wife with extra gusto. She got so deep into character that she actually fooled the man himself. One night, stirred by her passionate advances, Jean was seized by a fleeting illusion, a young woman, coming alive in the rhythm of his breathing. He couldn't help himself. "Noemi, what if I don't leave?" In the darkness, she answered with a single muffled gasp. But Jean understood. That gasp was loaded with horror. He added, "Don't worry, I'll go." That one sentence revealed everything. He turned to face the wall and heard her crying. This is one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the entire book. Noemi cried because she felt ashamed she'd failed to play the good wife convincingly. Her husband had seen through her, and he'd called her out to her face. But Jean's pain ran deeper. High self-esteem plus extreme sensitivity in that moment. He knew with absolute certainty she had never loved him. She could barely even maintain the pretense. In Paris, he tried visiting a prostitute. The blow was even worse. An old man helpfully advised him, "Come back at closing time, the girls are cheaper then." That remark stripped the act of buying intimacy bare, laid it out on the table without the slightest fig leaf. Jean couldn't bear it. The prostitute's excessively eager compliance stung him just as deeply. Her frantic, eager surrender, her complete absence of disgust, cut him even more deeply than when every inch of Noemi's body screamed, "Don't touch me." He flung a banknote onto the table under the woman's bewildered gaze. Without waiting for a response, he bolted for the door, scurrying into a dark alley like a thief. Later, Noemi wrote to him, saying she missed him terribly, and Jean couldn't help but hope again. What he didn't know was that Noemi didn't write those words out of longing. She'd encountered several handsome men after he'd left, and her mind had wandered. She wrote to her husband as a way of disciplining herself, reminding herself of her status as a married woman. Misled by this misunderstanding, Jean left Paris and returned home. The scene at the station was equally devastating. Waiting for him alongside Noemi was the servant's grandson. Standing together, the two of them looked like a golden couple. Jean wedged between them, the contrast too brutal to behold. And what was worse, in the days he'd been away, his wife had visibly blossomed. Back home, the blows kept coming. His father showed no concern for his son's health, only irritation that his daughter-in-law couldn't devote all her attention to him. The doctor they'd summoned happened to be quite handsome, and he made no effort to hide his interest in Noémie right in front of Jean, a point-blank insult. And the couple's dynamic remained as twisted as ever. There's a passage in the book that's absolutely heartbreaking. On certain nights, she softly called him to come closer. Seeing that he feigned deep sleep, she would rise and kiss him, as she always had. The kiss a saint bestows upon a leper. No one knows whether those lepers, their bodies covered in sores, ever rejoiced when their lips were touched by holiness. Jean Leper ultimately tore himself free from that embrace. "Don't touch me." This time, the one crying out in terror was him. And there you have the origin of the title, The Kiss to the Leper. Every kiss Noémie gave Jean was never born of love, but of guilt and moral obligation. Just like a saint bending down to kiss a leper, it was charity, not desire. Condescension dressed as compassion, not the yearning of equals. And Jean, this high self-esteem man, who'd half-read Nietzsche, would rather be rejected outright than pitied, because pity, in Nietzsche's framework, is the very hallmark of slave morality. To accept pity is to admit you are the weak, but to refuse pity means losing the last trace of his wife's goodwill, a deadlock with no solution, a suffocating deadlock forged entirely from kindness. After all that build-up, we can now fully unpack the Nietzsche piece for you. Before I begin, let me say this. The term slave morality, as I'm about to use it, is not an insult. It's a psychological mechanism, a hidden, self-protective mechanism that could exist in any one of us. Understanding it isn't about judging anyone, it's about seeing yourself clearly. All right, let's go. Nietzsche divided human morality into two systems. Master morality holds that strength is good, creation is good, vitality is good. Weakness and servility are not good. Slave morality flips it around. Meekness is virtue, submission is virtue, humility is virtue, while strength, pride, and desire are evil. Its core mechanism is devastatingly simple. Whatever I can't have, I declare to be bad. Whatever I can't do, I declare it noble not to do. Sounds a lot like the AQ mentality, doesn't it? There are similarities. But slave morality is far more dangerous than AQ, because AQ only deceives himself. Slave morality, at a certain point, slides from self-consolation into moral demands imposed on others. It shifts from inward to outward. This transition happens in complete silence, but once it does, the destructive power is enormous. What does that mean in practice? It means the strong must feel guilty. The successful must engage in self-denial. Excellence must be suppressed. You're not allowed to feel good about doing well. If you're thriving, you should feel guilty. If you don't feel guilty, then you're the bad guy. This kind of thinking is dangerous because life isn't a single game of winning and losing. Someone who has internalized slave morality will feel ashamed of their own vitality and life force. For every gain and success in life, they'll feel a deep sense of unworthiness. They'll hesitate in the face of opportunity and ultimately miss their chance to change. There's a key phrase here, powerlessness to change. Note that this implies change is something you actually want. You just can't pull it off right now. Slave morality is a tool of self-deception. It helps you forget the very idea of change. It convinces you that not changing is the right thing to do, that not changing is the noble thing to do. But the world is dynamic. What you can't do now doesn't mean you can't do it later. If you dress up your powerlessness as moral superiority, sure, it feels good in the short term, but when the opportunity for change eventually arrives, you won't be someone who can't anymore. You'll be someone who could but doesn't dare. Because you've already erected a monument to your own virtue. And who dares tear down their own monument? Life grinds to a halt from that point on. With that, let's return to Jean. Why did he ultimately march toward destruction? The logic chain goes like this: he wanted his wife's love, but he could see her revulsion toward him. He couldn't change his body or his abilities, and he had no way to make his wife genuinely fall in love with him. So what did he do? He reframed his powerlessness as moral virtue. I'm a gentleman. I would never force my wife. This gesture in itself isn't problematic, but it quietly produced a side effect. His wife began to feel ashamed of her own physical repulsion toward him. Picture it: a noble, selfless husband, standing there, asking for nothing, saying nothing. As his wife, facing a man like that, can you reject him with a clear conscience? Your guilt won't let you. So Noemi tried even harder to fake her love. And this is slave morality's most covert weapon. It doesn't coerce you with force. It guilts you with goodness. Using distorted moral standards to make others feel guilty, this maneuver reveals what the weaker party truly wants. Deep down, he's never abandoned his desire for change. He simply wants to influence reality without bearing the cost of change, without admitting his own desires, and without facing the risk of failure. What the slave morality thinker wants to achieve is this: I want to change the outcome, but not by becoming stronger myself. The reality they refuse to acknowledge is, if someone truly completely didn't care about change, they wouldn't need to guilt-trip others through moral pressure. The gestures of compensation Noemi made out of guilt looked a lot like love to Jean. When he fell ill and his wife nursed him, her sympathy also looked a lot like love. So he devised a profoundly twisted method to obtain love, not by making himself more attractive, because deep down, he knew he was powerless to change that. Instead, he would craft a moral image for himself, caring for the town's sick. For instance, to earn his wife's respect and sympathy, he substituted morality for desire. He transformed himself from a man who will never be loved into a man who cannot be refused. Because it's very hard to reject someone who is obviously noble with a clear conscience. That's not courtship, that's moral blackmail. Respect, guilt, and a sense of duty can produce a counterfeit intimacy, but that's just a moral debt, not an emotional choice. Once this logic takes hold, it leads to one truly terrifying conclusion. If I stop suffering, I'll lose you. Jean began clinging to every scrap of warmth by perpetually being ill. He had a friend who had contracted tuberculosis, and everyone kept their distance. But Jean insisted on going to the man's home to care for him. The friend died, Jean became infected, and in the end, Jean died too. Everyone was moved and awed by his selfless spirit, but we know now it wasn't selflessness. It was a man sinking deeper and deeper into slave morality, trading self-destruction for the guilt and respect of others. He didn't die of disease. He died of a belief: only when I am pitiful enough will the world be gentle with me. The final chapter of the story takes place at Jean's funeral. The opening line is very simple, but when I first read it, a chill ran down my spine. Monsieur Jérôme had gone to sleep. He'd gone to sleep again. His son's funeral, and he was pretending to sleep, just like he had at his wife's funeral all those years ago. This man's selfishness goes to the marrow. It runs so deep you can't even detect malice because it's too quiet. Throughout this entire novel, Mauriac never creates a single moment of intense conflict. Nobody argues, nobody explodes, nobody throws a plate. Everyone smiles, everyone is proper, and yet you can't shake the feeling that something is deeply, deeply wrong, because Jérôme is what you'd call an energy-parasitic parent. He cannot generate his own life force. He needs to siphon energy from the next generation by monopolizing their attention and emotions, sustaining his own sense of existence. When Jean was young, Jérôme wouldn't let him go to school. He used emotional blackmail, weeping and begging his son to stay, not ordering him, not hitting or scolding him, but making him feel guilty, making him voluntarily abandon his own plans. He steps down from the position of authority and places himself in the position of victim and martyr, making the child carry the moral debt. He achieves his manipulative goal while bearing zero moral responsibility for the child's decision. Sound familiar? Many parents seem open-minded, always saying, "You decide for yourself. We won't interfere." Outsiders think they're wonderfully understanding, but some children hear those words and immediately erupt, losing all emotional control, leaving bystanders baffled. The reason is, while they say this out loud, they create a very specific atmosphere of tension at other, subtler moments. It doesn't have to be obvious. Even the faintest signal, a child can pick up their parents' true feelings with laser precision and be swayed by them. In any power dynamic, the weaker party always develops an extraordinarily heightened sense of perception. It's self-preservation, which is why using slave morality thinking in a parent-child relationship is a deeply unethical act. Because it achieves the desired outcome with virtually zero risk, 100% of the time, the long-term impact on the child is a shattered sense of boundaries, difficulty saying no, a tendency toward guilt, an easy susceptibility to victim narratives. At this point, the story could have ended, but 10 years after publishing this novel, Mauriac wrote a new ending, the story of the father-in-law and daughter-in-law in the years following Jean's death. The will stipulated that as long as Noémie didn't remarry, the Pelluer fortune would pass to her upon Jérôme's death. On the surface, the two coexisted peacefully. Noémie cared for him diligently, but Jérôme's days were growing increasingly uncomfortable. He used to be the patriarch. Because of Jean's filial obedience and character flaws, Jérôme had been indulged and obeyed. The old man lived in comfort. But now he was growing older and weaker by the day. Meanwhile, his daughter-in-law was in her prime, having grown even stronger after years in his household. Jérôme had once played the role of the weak before his son. Now he genuinely was the weak one. And the longer they lived together, the less Noémie fell for his tricks. When he tried to sulk or throw a tantrum, she simply ignored him. Whatever he wanted, she pretended not to notice. Didn't he love pretending to sleep? Love staying in bed? Noémie treated him exactly like a life-size doll propped up in a chair, making him squirm with discomfort. There's a brilliantly written passage. Yes, she simply didn't care. She was actually laughing. She told him with benign mockery that his flushing was merely from fright. She had never spoken to him in that tone before. He was furious, struggling to contain himself, yet unable to hide his alarm. He declared that he wished for nothing but death. She nodded and replied, I see. 2 words. 2 weightless little words, wielded like a scalpel, slicing clean through the fortress Jérôme had spent decades building through emotional manipulation. Many readers absolutely love this final chapter. It has a certain cathartic satisfaction to it. That beautiful girl, who'd been trapped in a marriage finally after her husband's death, no longer had to play the role of the devoted wife. And the old man who'd spent his life pretending to sleep to dodge every responsibility finally met someone who refused to play his game. The manipulation of slave morality only works under one condition: the other person cares. When the other person stops caring, every act of moral blackmail drifts into the void like a satellite that has lost its gravity. Let's return to the question from the beginning of this video. Why is it that in some marriages, 2 people never argue, never raise a hand, never exchange a harsh word, and yet it feels more suffocating than violence? Now I can answer that. Because in a violent relationship, you possess at least one thing: an enemy. You know who's hurting you. You know where the wound is. You can point to it, show it to others, show it to yourself. You can hate. You can flee. You can even fight back. Your pain has a name, a shape, an origin. But in a polite relationship, you have nothing. No wound, no perpetrator, no evidence. All you have is a vague, diffuse, indescribable sense of suffocation. It's not like a knife, not like a fist. It's like carbon monoxide, colorless, odorless. You can't smell it. You can't see it. But every single day, you are being poisoned. You try confiding in a friend. Your friend says, "He treats you pretty well though." You go crying to your parents. They say, Be grateful how many people would kill to marry someone like that. You even look up the law. The law says, this does not constitute any actionable form of harm. So you start doubting yourself. It must be my problem. I must be too greedy. I must be ungrateful. A man who's done nothing wrong has given me his entire life, and I'm still not satisfied? You see, this is the most precision-engineered way that politeness kills. It doesn't need to use force. It just needs you to believe that resistance is unjustified. A violent marriage destroys your body and your sense of safety, but yourself remains. You know you're suffering, and you know it's not your fault. A polite marriage destroys something deeper, your very right to feel pain. It makes you unable to even utter the words, I'm in pain. Because to say them is to accuse a good person. And accusing a good person in everyone's moral instinct is simply not allowed. So you swallow the pain. 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, 10 years. You swallow and swallow until you've forgotten you were ever in pain. You think you've accepted it, but you haven't. You've just gone numb. The distance between numbness and acceptance is like the distance between being alive and not being dead. They look the same, but an entire universe separates them. Mauriac saw through all of this nearly 100 years ago. Jean Pellouer and Noémie are not extreme cases. They are a template that has been replicated millions of times and is still being mass-produced to this day. Every girl whose parents pressured her into marrying a man with good conditions could be Noémie. Every wife who's been told, you should be grateful, could be Noémie. Every woman who lies beside her husband at night and feels like she's lying in a morgue could be Noémie. And every man who knows his partner doesn't love him, yet chooses to sustain the relationship by being good to her, could be Jean. Every husband whose love strategy is, she'll eventually be moved by my devotion, could be Jean. Everyone who substitutes moral blackmail for genuine attraction and self-sacrifice for self-growth has already stepped onto Jean's path. And at the end of that path, Mauriac has already walked it for us. He wrote it clearly, the end is not reconciliation, not epiphany, not some kind of rock-bottom comeback. The end is a man lying down quietly. Everyone thinking he's a saint. Only he knows he didn't die for others. He simply found, at last, a dignified excuse not to go on living. And that is what truly sends a chill down my spine about this book. It's not about a failed marriage. It's about a way of living. A way of living that our era massively encourages, massively glorifies, and massively manufactures. Be a good person. Endure a little. Don't be selfish. Don't ask for too much. Everyone says it's fine, what more could you want? Have you heard these words before? Have you said them yourself? If you've heard them, if you've said them, then congratulations, you're already standing in that airless drawing room from Mauriac's novel. The fireplace is burning. Steam rises from the teacup. The person across from you is smiling. Everything is fine. Everything is proper. Everything is killing you. And the only thing you can do is first admit one truth: not every cage has iron bars. Some cages are welded from politeness, locked with kindness, painted with, for your own good. From the outside, it doesn't look like a cage. It looks like a home. I'd like to leave you with 2 questions. No rush to answer. Take them with you. Think slowly. The first question: if right now you're in a relationship that everyone says is great, but your body is saying no. Every day, you perform the right motions, smiling, being considerate, being grateful, and yet you feel none of the warmth of being alive. Then is your unhappiness just being dramatic? Or is it the last flicker of your life force trying to save itself? The second question: what if Jean Pellouer hadn't died? What if he'd lived to 40, 50, 60? What if he'd endured that marriage for another 30 years? What kind of person would he have become? You don't need to think too far. Just think about those middle-aged people around you whose eyes have already gone dark. They too were once somebody's Jean or somebody's Noémie. It's just that nobody wrote their story into a novel. I'm Franco. See you next time.